Yes, you read that title correctly. And yes, this video is very long. Can you believe it's just the first part of 2? Because unfortunately, I can. At the time of making this video, Limbus Company has 133 identities, all of which are relatively unique, mostly anyways, and as someone with over 1,000 hours of experience in Limbus Company, and around 1,700 hours of experience editing videos on it, it's no surprise I have a lot of thoughts regarding Limbus's vast roster of playable little death machines. Of course, my thoughts on these IDs are not just limited to ID strength tier lists like what I've done in the past. Though ID strength will certainly be an important factor about some of these IDs, there's a lot that makes up an ID in Limbus, and I want this duo of videos to celebrate that, because I feel like I don't give enough attention to the non-combat perspective of Limbus Company, which is a shame, since it's arguably the most important aspect. Naturally, like the fool that I am, I figured there was no better way to get across my thoughts on every ID in Limbus than to just talk about every ID in Limbus for what will inevitably be over 3 hours of video. Yippee. So when I give my thoughts about each ID in this video, at the end of their segment, I'll give them a rating on screen based on how much I enjoy them as a part of Limbus on a ranking of F to S, with a special tier reserved for my favorite ID in the game. My enjoyment can come from a lot of factors, whether that be their art, uptight story, enjoying them in battle, or whatever else I have associated with them, and yes, if you couldn't tell, this will be a very biased video. I plan to cover the first half of these sinners and their IDs in this part, and do the other half at a later time, so hey, that's like the perfect thing to use that subscribe button for, if you want, anyway. Since I always start with Yi-sung in these kinds of videos, and I kinda want to delay talking about a certain one of his IDs for as long as possible, I want to begin with not Yi-sung. And when I think of sinners that are distinctly not Yi-sung, I always think of Faust. While this shouldn't really matter too much, it's worth mentioning that I will be going in release order for the IDs for each sinner. And speaking of the rules, in case you missed it in the intro, I won't be talking about base IDs in this video. They already got a dedicated video in the past, so it would be redundant to talk about them. Something that isn't redundant to talk about is our first ID, Lobotomy Corp Remnant Faust. This is a really good ID to start with for quite a few reasons. Firstly, she's a fascinating case of launch ID syndrome. Since at Uptide 3, she's got this extremely bizarre skill 1 that rolls a 9 for no real reason, and considering how it was changed with Uptide 4, it almost feels like it was an unintentional bug that they couldn't patch out any other way, which is something that can be said for a lot of launch IDs, since a lot of them didn't really work. And LCR Faust is no exception, considering her passive literally couldn't function at the time of Limbus's launch, at least not without the help from Blade Lineage Yi-sung. At the same time, LCR Faust has this absurd conditional on her skill 3, which is also a launch exclusive, mind you, giving her a massive plus 3 coin power to her already strong skill 3. Plus 11 coin power on anything that isn't a single coin skill is certainly something special, and is kind of in what I would refer to as MD numbers territory, even if the damage itself isn't super impressive. The thing that makes this ID actually fitting to start this whole thing off is the fact that this was one of the first IDs I ever got and actually used. I can't remember for sure what ID I got first overall, but LCR Faust was one of several IDs I remember taking into my first fight against Cromer, and embarrassingly enough, was the first time I realized how the skill bag worked when I was frustrated I wasn't getting her very powerful purple skill as much as I wanted. Combine that with her very striking Uptide 3 art, and I have a pretty nostalgic fondness for LCR Faust. And I'm glad she still has her niche in Limbus as a very, very fast Faust ID, with that stupidly good 4 haste gain from her skill 2, as well as still probably managing against all odds to be in the upper half of 2-star IDs, even in the modern age. Okay, and before you think every ID is gonna get as much attention as LCR Faust, Warp Faust is here to be a lot less interesting to talk about. Look, I don't dislike Warp Faust. In fact, from an aesthetic perspective, I really like Warp Faust, though really most of Faust's IDs have very pleasing art and or sprite work. Her weapon especially has always stood out to me, and I don't really have a reason as to why, besides that I think it looks neat. Her overall kit is definitely not boring, since being a slow Faust ID is arguably just as good as being a fast Faust ID. A slow fluid sac usage has massive advantages in certain instances when you're using a lot of ego and want to restore that SP after all your teammates have gone, or, naturally, if your team has taken a lot of damage. Of course, there's downsides to this too, but it's small intricacies like this that make Limbus theory crafting pretty dynamic and interesting at times. Though other times, it's just about shoving the strongest IDs into the square hole, even if they weren't made to fit. Her other niche, applying bind and attack power down, is still pretty unoccupied. And while she's not fantastic at attack power down debuffing, her bind application is better than the Ryoshu ID, whose direct inspiration's whole thing was binding technique, but more on that later. Overall, Warp Faust is what I would describe as inoffensive, if a little bit plain, if you're not a fan of nerding out over niche fluid sac use cases, or the effects of charge count on Limbus society. The one who grips Faust is complicated. I like her fine enough as an ID, and really like her 2 passives for SP gain, but my god, a 12 roll on that skill 3 is pretty indefensible in the modern age of Limbus, and I can only imagine that Faust, with a bit of a numbers tune-up or added bleed conditionals, could still be pretty solid, considering her utility in the form of nails, SP gain, and gaze, which remains an objectively good debuff. She's one of those IDs I really hope sees some love when Uptype 5, or whatever equivalent, eventually comes out, because her basic concept still holds up well. Now outside of her kit, look, it's no secret I don't like the look of the N-Corp IDs, and while Faust is probably the best looking out of them, I'm still not a big fan of her sprite or her ID art, and while her animations are cool, they are also notorious for taking ever. Though, in spite of all of my lack of love towards this ID, and honestly even towards Cromer herself especially, I do have to yield and say that Faust, being a gamer who sits at her computer with her big red button that acts like a mouse, I think, is pretty funny. And any ID that changes a Sinner's hair is at least more visually interesting than your average outfit swap. So the one who grips Faust ends up as a bit of a mixed bag, but I'm still pretty positive on her compared to most people, I think, even if her skill 3 animation looks a little like she's a puppet on strings at the beginning, and please tell me I'm not the only one who sees that. Zwei Faust is a constant reminder to me that yes, indeed, IDs that were teased pre-launch can actually be released post-launch, except for Gregor, because apparently Rhino Gregor can't exist. Zwei Faust herself, well, she's got a few things going for her. Firstly, I think that defense level up synergy is really neat, and I wish there was a more solid team based around spreading it to the other members to fulfill conditionals, but we'll get to the others via IDs in the next part, I suppose. Zwei Faust is, at the end of the day, a miniature version of Zwei Gregor, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, since as I said, I enjoy the defense level up gimmick, even if it is objectively pretty weak looking back on it. Not to say the tankiness aspect is bad, but the lack of real conditionals based on defense level up does hurt. The effects she does have, I mean, that 4 HP heal on Clash Win with her skill 3 really is something I don't think I'll ever understand the idea behind. How, canonically, does winning this clash heal Faust? Most self-healing things in Limbus have pretty obvious reasoning behind them. Usually ego weapons, vampirism, or bug powers, patent pending on that one. But this, does winning the clash buy her enough time to take some PTO? And if so, clearly, that time off was not all that fulfilling if it is restoring a mere 1.7% of her max HP at level 50. From an aesthetic perspective, I just really like the Zwei outfits and their weapons, and despite how stupid that skill 3 conditional is, the animation is undeniably pretty satisfying, and it's not like it takes away from the ID. She certainly can fall into the what does she even do category of an ID, since the Season 2's Zwei IDs are some of the very few IDs with none of the main 7 keywords, so she only really fits into a team if your options are limited, but for what she is, she's not bad, and a pretty cool ID in my opinion. 7 Faust. It is a shame that the Rupture team I prefer can't really use 7 Faust all that well, because I think she still holds up well just on the basis of being a generically strong ID with good animations, especially that flourish with her glasses at the end of her skill 3, and notably, good sound design. Having a different Clash Wind sound effect gets you pretty high up on my list, since that is one of the sounds you'll hear the most playing Limbus, so it's nice to have a variety. Unfortunately, that's all I really have to say about 7 Faust, because she is just good and looks good, nothing insane, but I certainly like her. Now, how does Faust have almost double the amount of words in her segment as 7 Faust, a 3-star ID? That is a good question. Regret Faust is an ID I lost a lot of lunacy on, or at least what used to be a lot of lunacy for me. Now, the amount of pulls I did for her would be considered child's play to me now, but I actually had to wait until the second Walpurgis Nacht in order to get either regrets from the first Walpurgis, so for a while, I kinda just assumed she wasn't all that good to make myself feel less bad about missing out on her. And while the lack of coin power conditionals is certainly noticeable, I still think Regret Faust holds up well as a generalist, but really shines on a Tremor team and as a source of cheap AoE. But, in terms of things they could have done with the concept of an ID based around Forsaken Murderer, I think there is a lot of missed potential here. Somehow, IDs not using Bind as much as they should in their kit is pretty common for me to talk about, and that is no different here. Instead of Self-Tremor, I was really hoping, before her release, that this ID would be Self-Bind, and gain damage based on how much slower she is than the target. A mechanic like Zweiishmael's defensive stance would have worked great on this concept to allow retargeting regardless of speed, but what we got was, and I will say this begrudgingly, pretty alright. And while I don't really like her Uptype 3 art, I do have to give it to her. Her Uptype 1 art is pretty cute. I like the way she looks there. I don't like Blade Lineage Salsu Faust. I don't even think that's all that unpopular of an opinion, but let's be real. If BL Meursault didn't exist for whatever reason, BL Faust would be in the bottom echelon of 3 stars in the game. While it might be a bit unfair judging BL Faust outside of the team she was clearly designed to be in, indulge me for a moment. Her skill 1 rolls a 9 with 3 coins, and needs 5 plus poise for plus 1 coin power for a total of 12 rolling skill 1. Not too bad. But she just gains 2 poise count and 1 poise potency on heads hit from the skill itself. Only 2 poise potency from the skill if she started with none, and only 1 poise potency for every additional usage. Her skill 2 is a 2 coin 16 roller, but can roll an 18 at 7 plus poise, and while this skill gives a bunch of poise count, it gives no potency. This means our only real way to gain poise potency and fulfill our conditionals is to win a clash at high poise count with our skill 3, or just try to spam our skill 1 to slowly build it up. Even after all of that, what is her purpose? Well, to inflict Red Plum Blossom, a very bad, unique bleed status on a team with next to no bleed synergy. So the only real usage it has is increasing crit chance and crit damage, which is fine, I guess. I also just love how her first skill 3 conditional is practically impossible. Since 10 Red Plum Blossom is the max stack, and it gets lowered on hit, not even on crit, which would make way more sense, and it is only inflicted by BL Faust. By the time you are using a skill 3 with her, your RPB stack is almost certainly below 5, if it ever got close to that in the first place. Do most of her non-Red Plum Blossom problems go away when you add Blade Lineage Mentor Meursault to the equation? I mean, yeah. But while I like her skill 1 animation, I think her skill 2 is boring, and her skill 3 is, just fine. It's a shame, too, because I really like her Uptype 1 art due to these ribbons in her hair, but they just aren't present in her sprite, which really sucks. I don't want to dislike this ID, but I'm sorry. She could have had so much more in terms of unique visuals, and her actual kit could feel better with just some small changes to her unique status, and it doesn't help that she was released alongside the absolute behemoth that is BL Meursault, but we'll get there eventually. Butler Faust exists, and while she does kinda just exist in my mind, I still like her a good amount. Maybe it's the innate cool factor of butler outfits and overdramatic fighting styles, but her skill 3 is pretty notable because it really has no reason to get +2 coin power from its 5+ sinking count conditional, but a 20 rolling 4 coin skill for a 2-star ID is kinda crazy good, considering the effects of the skill are also strong. Echoes is a fun debuff, so any ID with application of it gets a bonus for me, and her sinking count positive skill 2 is just good. She's a solid ID, and her up-tie arts fit together pretty well when overlaid, which is a pretty neat thing that I don't think any other ID does. Multi-crack Faust is really strong, and while I am known for disliking the charge archetype, that was back when it was just charge count. Multi-crack Faust is pretty solidly a charge ID, as in charge potency. And my biggest problem with her is just that her skill 1 doesn't feel good to use, since her skill 2 and skill 3 are quite the opposite, and feel fantastic to fire off. Okay, I lied. My biggest problem with her is absolutely how, in order to gain charge potency, she needs 3 owned envy. Especially when passives that are actually passive and don't need anything to passively activate were definitely not uncommon even when she was released a while back. Now, I do wish this wasn't another charge unit that isn't punished for not having enough charge count, and is just allowed to have any lack of it substituted by her HP. I don't mind it too much here, since it would be a pain to get to 10 charge count with just her skill 1 and occasional skill 3, and I recognize that a part of what makes MC Faust fun is the never-ending-ish cycle of pumping out really high damaging skill 2s. But hey, that would be all the more reason to make her skill 1 not absolutely terrible to use. When she was first released, I wasn't really a fan of the half-robot face, but it's grown on me a little bit, even if it's still not my favorite aesthetic by any means. And while her up-tie 3 art is somehow one of the most bland ones of the modern era, all that really matters is that the third hit of the skill 2 hits so hard I can physically feel it, even if I'm only partially paying attention to the game. I want to love Ardor Blossom Star Faust. I really do. I love her hair, the outfit is great, more burn support is what the game needed at the time, and the self-burn idea is well implemented with the, self-implosion mechanic, to put it lightly. Her animations are also really good, so what's the problem? Well, it's a really stupid nitpick when I think about it, but the payoff for blowing Faust up is capped at 16. Accounting for the on-hit burn and the burn from her passive, and look, 16 burn is good. I'm not shitting on that. It's just, for the cost of killing an entire 3-star ID, putting a little max 5 per enemy on her blowing the fuck up feels a little underwhelming. Again, this is absolutely a nitpick, and this ID is still strong. Her empowered skill 3 is a fuck ton of damage as it is. I just wish the thematic burn application on her death wasn't quite as limited. There will probably be a lot of these small hangups in these videos that make no sense to you watching, but you consented to listening to my opinions by clicking on this video, so that shouldn't be a surprise. Outside of that, I do like this ID, but I can't fully love it like I wanted to. Maybe if I use her more, I won't mind as much, but as it stands, she can only end up in the A tier, which is still a great ranking for a great ID. After Faust, we've got Don Quixote. Specifically, we are starting with Warp Dawn, and well, look. I don't like Warp Dawn. She was indeed the ID that started my distaste for charge IDs back in the day, and the reason why is definitely petty at best. It was mostly to do with Railway 1 optimization. You see, back in the olden days of Limbus Company, you couldn't choose which IDs would get an extra skill slot. And in order to get this beautiful low-turn Railway 1 banner, back when that was particularly impressive, resetting over and over and over and over again was necessary. And no stage pushed me to the limits of my sanity more than the damn Snake Inquisitors, where W Dawn was the one who needed an extra skill slot. Now, I don't like to ramble on about content that is not in the game at this point, but I cannot fully explain to you how much resetting that stage and using W Dawn made me despise using her. It's really no fault of her own, but I also just find her kit extremely bare bones considering her payoff, and her animations are just fine. I know most people would disagree there, but Rift Space never really felt all that good to me, and a big part of that is because my main usage of her came during those Railway 1 resets where I was numb to all emotion. Also, Rocinante is ugly, I'm sorry, it has to be said. Shi Association Don Quixote is a nothing ID. And while I have made a video dedicated to the Shi IDs, Dawn isn't really representative of what the Shi IDs are like. Not as though the sample size is all that big. And her tiny bit of poise and very specific haste synergy makes her kinda just exist. I don't particularly like her beyond the fact that she is a Shi ID, and her Uptai 1 art is honestly way too good and dramatic considering how short her Uptai story is. I'll have more to say when I get to the actual Shi IDs, but for now, Shi Dawn is certainly one of the IDs in Limbus Company. Also, Rocinante is ugly. N-Corp Don Quixote. Ugh. I think this ID has the single worst Uptai 3 art in the game. Even if there are others that are more boring or whatever, at least those ones aren't kind of annoying to look at, like this one is. I strongly prefer the Uptai 1 art, even if I don't really love that one either. It's better than this thing. The art aside, I mean, what is this ID even doing? Nails plus Tremor plus debuffing in Season 1, a time where archetypes were barely fleshed out on their own, let alone fleshed out enough to allow for a hybrid ID like this to actually thrive or see any real use. She's a fine enough Tremor ID, I guess? And while her Nails application is pretty good, her numbers just do not stack up in a way that can justify her usage. There is a lot going against this ID for me. I don't like the super heavy armor as an aesthetic, I don't like blood on my IDs in big amounts, and frankly, her sprite just looks kinda wrong. Also, Rosinate's wait, that doesn't apply here. Sank South Director Dawn is quite the opposite of Dawn. She's a beautiful, perfect Don Quixote who deserves to be protected at all costs. And that's a phrase I do not throw around lightly. I love her Uptai story, and both of her arts are tied together in a way that flows into each other and tells a story in a way that a lot of other IDs don't do as directly, which I think is fun. Since she's the original Sank ID, I have a bias towards the declared duel mechanic she introduced, and I've always enjoyed archetypes revolving around being fast in video games. It's a shame that her numbers, conditionals, and coins don't stand the test of time. Especially these X plus speed conditionals compared to the faster than the target by X amount conditionals. The latter is just almost objectively superior to the former, and it really makes her show her age. Now, I do really enjoy how much Sank Dawn leans into the traditional duel stereotypes, and her extra damage on Clash Win is nice thematically, but I also firmly believe her throwing her glove in the Salu skill should have been an extra coin that inflicts fragile onto the enemy on heads hit or crit or something, all things to hope for in a potential Uptai 5. Please, Project Moon, I beg you, give the real Sank Dawn the love she deserves in the future. At the very least, she deserves a standard 16 rolling skill 2 with 2 coins, but hey, all I'm saying is that glove would make for a really funny unbreakable coin. Unfortunately, Rocinante is still ugly. Middle Little Sister Don Quixote is the first signs of my Season 3 ID bias. I believe that most of these seasonal IDs released for Kanto 5 are excellently designed and took big strides towards introducing new mechanics that have stuck around for IDs ever since. Middle Dawn is the first real resonance-based ID, and while her conditional is certainly very strict compared to the conditionals we would end up seeing later, I think all of the discussion around how to build an Envy team that could consistently get 6 Envy resonance in order to activate her counter effect was really interesting. Any ID that encourages team building or theory crafting like that, while also not having ultra-strict limitations on the specific IDs that need to be used, is gonna be an ID that I give extra Escu brownie points to. I have to admit that her skills aren't fantastic, but her coin power conditionals are so unique, gaining +1 coin power against anything with a vengeance mark, not just limited to her own skills, meaning even a Yearning Merkala can have +1 coin power if used with Middle Dawn and the target has vengeance mark. There's still barely any other IDs that have coin power conditionals tied to their passives like that. And I'm fairly sure Middle Dawn is the only one that can do this while having a proper multi-coin ego. And her other aspect of her passive, gaining envy damage based on how many hits allies and her have taken, has definitely gotten more viable since her release due to unbreakable AoE coins. Middle Dawn worked as a prototype of sorts to IDs with clashable counters, and honestly, for an early counter-based ID, I think she still holds up, as an ID that can replace her skill 1 with her counter pretty consistently in order to make up for the mediocre skill 1. It's just a shame her outfit, chains, and tattoos suck, and Rocinante is ugly. Meat Lantern Dawn is very silly, but outside of just being whimsical, she's actually pretty practical as a Rupture and Sustain tank ID. I wish more IDs would lean into doing something with aggro, like how Meat Lantern Dawn gains Clash power against enemies when she has aggro, also known as basically every turn, but also getting an extra bonus for hitting enemies that were targeting her by default is a really cool mechanic, and 6 HP per hit is genuinely not a bad payoff for not a hard conditional. Hell, that's 1.5 Faust skill 3 Clash wins per coin. She's got a Rupture count positive skill 1, and potentially Rupture count neutral skill 2 and 3, and yet people act like Rupture has no count on their IDs. Her healing on her skill 3, especially if below 50% HP, leads to a ton of potential healing. Easily over 100 HP healing if you have enough Rupture on the target, meaning well over 25 Faust skill 3 Clash wins. Okay, I'm being mean to Faust, but seriously, Meat Lantern Dawn's Sustain, Concept, and actual kit are all fantastic. And I really like this sprite of hers, where she's this multicolored tornado thing. Except, I think you already know what I want to say. Despite being the Dawn ID I probably have the least to say about, BL Dawn is still good. I particularly like how snappy her animations are, for lack of a better word, and the way she practically pops out of the screen when using Fare Thee Well is fun. Unlike BL Faust, BL Dawn works without BL Meursault and doesn't feel like absolute shit to use. Of course, she is still a worse ID, but that's standard for a 2-star. Providing extra poise via her passive and even her support passive makes her a miniature version of Nebulizer, and although poise potency is generally less of a problem than poise count, she gives that too if she crits on her skill 3. BL Dawn is also lucky because Rocinante is mostly covered by her outfit, and really, look at that face. How could I be mad at her? T-Corp Dawn utilizes the borrowed time effect, so she's instantly enjoyable in my books due to actually using statuses from the enemies she's based on, and not only that, we got 2 of them, since Time Moratorium works as another neat way to nuke down enemies, specifically Sloth Weak or Fatal ones. Time Moratorium's niche usage and the manner in which it deals damage are both very satisfying to me. It creates a situation where you stack up damage and wait in anticipation, knowing you're going to see a stupidly large number once it detonates. Unfortunately, I don't really love how she can only gain Clash power on her skill 1 and skill 2, since it doesn't feel as good as coin power. But her animations feel very unique, especially her skill 3 on borrowed time, since all the teleporting around is something no other ID does. Okay, well, besides T-Corp Rodian, but you get what I mean. Also, can someone please explain to me how she manages to show off Rocinante in this, assumedly, full body armor? I mean, at this point, it's just wizardry. So, I've kept these past few IDs on the shorter end on purpose, because this is going to be a bit of a doozy. I don't dislike Manager Dawn, despite my first impressions of her. A lot of people seem to think I hate all of the Bloodfiend IDs, because on the day of release, I focused on the most negative aspects of Manager Dawn's kit. However, despite not hating her, I don't entirely love her. Now from an aesthetic and animation perspective, this ID is pretty close to perfection. Her outfit and sprite are nice, and the only problem I have is that for videos, I have to edit out her giant hard blood lance because it makes placing her into any scene an absolute pain. Now that I'm saying giant hard blood lance out loud, I'm starting to realize I should probably find a better way to phrase it. Anyways, Dawn's big stabby red thing also lends itself to having some of the most cinematic animations of the IDs, which makes sense considering the amount of effort that is often put into these big seasonal IDs. And with that effort comes skills. Lots and lots of skills. And alongside those, and you might have caught my allusion towards this in Middle Dawn's segment, extremely specific team building. Without the other Blood Fiends, Manager Dawn doesn't fall apart, but she is literally locked out of 3/8 of her kit, and I'm still not sure exactly how to feel about this. But I think it's certainly less interesting than something like Middle Dawn's team building, since it's much more binary. Did you run Priest Gregor? Well, then you can have the Empowered Skill 1. Building around 6 Envy Resonance is much more flexible in that sense. Needing specific sin affinities rather than a specific ID. Fortunately, I do think the only really good skill enhancements are the skill 1 and the skill 3, one of which is innate for Manager Dawn being fielded while using Manager Dawn, so that doesn't really require much effort to achieve. I know the extra coin on the skill 2 and the attack weight, it's a lot of damage, but, well, I guess I shouldn't spoil my thoughts on using Barbara Otis. And I also would rather save my hard blood for the enhanced skill 1 and skill 3, considering her base skill 2 is satisfying enough to me as it is. Her sustain is pretty insane. Even if she's constantly and very literally bleeding away her very low max health, her on-hit HP regen is almost always going to be enough to more than make up for it. Even if it has unfortunate anti-synergy with her passive, which gives her damage up based on missing HP, which is another thing I don't love about her. She's undeniably a strong ID, and she definitely brought some innovations to the common Limbus ID formula. But when my expectations were placed at the level of Wild Hunt Heathcliff, I think Manager Dawn fell just a little bit short for me. Still a very enjoyable ID, with fantastic art and animations, and best of all, no Rocinante. After all of that going on with Manager Dawn, Sankeist Dawn is a contrast to her complexity, to say the least. And while she's certainly powerful, with her easy speed conditionals reaching average or above average numbers, I really dislike how she is quite literally just Sank West Meursault, but with Nerve Attack instead of Focus Attack, and Burn instead of Rupture. Nerve Attack is literally just Focus Attack, but kind of worse, due to a lack of coin power on the third stack. Though I guess the extra damage conditionals are nice for critting on targets with Burn and Nerve Attack, I guess. The similarities between Sank West and Sank East makes sense, considering they are both from the Sank Association, but I wish there was more of a difference between them, considering Sank South and Sank West's gimmick are different enough. So I can't help but be disappointed in that, even if I should, in theory, like her on the basis of being a speed-based ID. I just can't entirely get behind the idea that this ID and this ID are pretty much functionally the same outside of an archetype, which kinda ruins her for me, as much as I hate to say it. R.I.N. And yes, I know, if everything goes right, this video is releasing the same day a new Ryoshu ID is, or basically immediately after. These things happen. I'd rather give myself time to actually have thoughts on an ID, rather than give you a first impression. So I'll be covering that ID in part 2. In the meantime, we still have plenty of Ryoshu as is, including 7 Association Ryoshu. Now, this is an ID I find has some of the most disparity in terms of opinions on her. I think I fall on the side with the higher opinion, though even that has definitely fallen off over time. She's got a single coin, high clashing skill 1 and skill 2, as well as an actually really solid skill 3, even by today's high standards. It's unfortunate that one of her skills is the worst skill in the game, / the blunt skill. Yeah. There's nothing I can say about this skill that hasn't been said before, but it really is quite the crowning achievement of skill names. I do enjoy the Clash win in order to get benefits archetype of ID, and 7 Ryoshu leans into that really hard considering her low coins, but high rolls. Of course, her main draw is the 5/ fragility on Clash win, next turn no less, with her skill 3. The only and main issue being, you can't run a different Ryoshu ID to take advantage of this, and gee, I wonder which one I mean by that. Outside of her kit, her Komanyeke that she constantly says on kill was stuck in my head back in the day when I used her, and I still think it's pretty funny. Kurikumo Ryoshu has quite the story associated with her, so bear with me. Around the launch days of Limbus, I didn't have the battle pass for a while, but I knew that Bleed looked like a fun archetype to try and run, and that was my first mistake. But my second mistake was looking online and finding a certain website that I will not name in this video, saying Kurikumo Ryoshu makes Bleed meta. Quite the strong statement, to the point she was even put in the double S tier, I believe. Kurikumo Ryoshu is not double S tier. So, I sharded her. The very first ID I ever used my shards on was Kurikumo fucking Ryoshu. Do you know how much I've used her since then? Yeah, it's not much. Look, she's not the worst. And with Kurikumo Heathcliff and Ishmael existing, she has a more solid use case now. Kinda. And while her bleed count isn't terrible, her damage is. I try not to hold that tragic backstory against Kurikumo Ryoshu in particular, especially since I actually quite like her in-game sprite and art, but I can't act like I succeed in not having my biases against using her, lamenting about my time grinding Mirror Dungeon 1 with the sole thought in my mind being about getting this overpowered ID. My, how the times change. Chef Ryoshu is up there for IDs I used to defend to the death. Why did I used to be so adamant about using her? Well, because she is actually good, even now, but mostly because something about the way I can cook anything scales its damage, as in giving flat damage based on missing HP, really scratched my brain in the right way. And her skill 2 rolling an 18 put her on the same level as Ting Tang Hong Lu in my mind. It's a shame that the next Ryoshu ID was such a strict upgrade in almost every way, because I miss being able to use Chef Ryoshu without feeling like I'm just handicapping myself. On another note, HP healing down, while somehow not only on Chef Ryoshu anymore, is a debuff I thought would get better as Limbus moved forward, but more raw damage has ended up being the solution to enemies healing rather than bothering with debuffs to reduce it. It's a small thing, but I'd like to see something done with HP healing down in some way to make it feel useful. But that's probably impossible considering how much damage other IDs can pump out with little to no effort. There's not much elaboration to be done here, since I just think she's solid in most every category that's relevant for this video, and being the first Ruin Italian ID also increased my enjoyment of her. Early Limbusescu wishes that Chef Ryoshu was still an S-tier ID, but she's just A-tier now simply due to the passage of time. Okay, so considering what I said before, you might be expecting me to hate on Warp Ryoshu for overshadowing Chef Ryoshu, my beloved. But I really can't. I have mixed opinions on a lot of things to do with Warp Ryoshu, especially regarding how strong she was at the time of her release, just compared to all of the other IDs in the game. But while she's still strong, her comparative strength isn't quite what it used to be. And that isn't to say she's bad at all, it's just that every other ID Project Moon releases nowadays feels like they are on some sort of performance-enhancing drug. Of course, Warp Ryoshu has a drug of her own, and that would be her animations and sound design. She's over the top in every way, including her Uptai story, which is one of the more memorable ones in the game, because, my god, she is such a fucking edgelord, and it's hilarious. Her only downside is her low clashing skill 1, but her skill 2 would be in the running for potentially strongest skill of its rank in the game, if that slot wasn't already undeniably taken by he who should not be discussed. If you weren't around for her release, I can't quite describe to you the absurdity associated with a 23 rolling 3-coin skill 2 that inflicts 2/ fragility at the start of it. There was nothing else even close to matching it on a base level in terms of clashing and damage. I don't even need to talk about DDEDR, besides to say that it kind of re-established a standard for nuke skills, since Quick Suppression and Rip Space were from launch, and nothing like them truly existed since then, until Warp Ryoshu. Even back when I disliked charge IDs pretty strongly, I had to admit that her animations made me enjoy using her, and now that just stands true more than ever. In the process of making this segment, I've realized that Ryoshu's IDs from launch up until LCCB Ryoshu all have quite a lot of personal connection for me in some way. Specifically, the lack of a 0-0 Ryoshu for over a year was a big problem for me in Limbus. I still don't fully understand what took them so long, and on that same note, this, alongside Pirate Gregor, was the first ammo ID since launch. So, I was very excited for this ID for multiple reasons. I should not have been excited. This is the only ID of the seasonal ones released in Bon Voyage that, ironically, missed the mark. Her kit is just a mess, her numbers are mediocre, and while I cannot deny the theoretical raw cool power of Ryoshu with a shotgun, the fact that it's only used on the skill 3, for its intended purpose anyway, is pretty disappointing. Especially since this was only just as Project Moon realized that Poise IDs should actually exist again, and therefore they kinda forgot to give Ryoshu extra crit damage on that skill 3's third coin. I'll try to avoid saying this about every outdated ID in this and the next video, but I would really love to see LCCB Ryoshu get some serious tune-ups for an Uptai 5, since the foundation is here for a really cool ID. Okay, you wanna talk about really cool IDs? Liu Ryoshu is fucking awesome. Her art is great, I love her animations, even if they are a bit simple. She gave us an ID to use 4th match Flame on, and she's actually pretty solid to boot. You could say this about a lot of 2-star IDs, but Ryoshu feels like a mini 3-star. With her conditionals active, and her extra damage boost achieved, her rolls of 13, 16, and 16, not even accounting for the 1 extra clash power she gains on all of those, resemble a 3-star without conditionals. And considering how easy Burn is to get going, you could basically say these are her base numbers. The only gripe I have is a bit of a weird one, but I wish her passive was something more interesting than an on-kill burn spread. Though that's really a very minor nitpick in an ID I otherwise really enjoy in every other way. Okay, I've been talking about IDs for a long time now. Let's all just take a bit of a breather. Maybe you can like the video at this point if you've enjoyed it. Let's all just calm down before I ruin your mood. I really fucking hate Butler Ryoshu. In fact, she's perhaps in my bottom 5 of IDs purely based on her kit. Everything else about Butler Ryoshu is amazing. Her Uptie 1 and Uptie 3 art, her Uptie story, her battle sprite is okay. Actually, I don't really like how maid outfits look, frankly, but her animations are undeniably great, and hey, I'll even give it to her that I like the way her skill 3 can reuse itself. Everything else, bleh. First of all, as I've talked about with T-Corp Dawn, IDs that mostly only gain clash power for their conditionals in the modern day of Limbus, which I would count as Season 4 and beyond, do have an innate disadvantage with me. I think it's a lot less satisfying only gaining clash power for conditionals, unless it's a lot, and in Butler Ryoshu's case, it's not terrible. But it doesn't make up for not having coin power conditionals on her skill 1, or especially her skill 2. My much bigger problem, and a problem T-Corp Dawn didn't have, is that I think Butler Ryoshu is boring. Now that's very subjective, but I mean that in the sense that Butler Ryoshu is based off of a certain enemy, and that enemy's entire gimmick is this debuff, Binding Technique, which while in its current form would definitely be too overpowered to implement, at least implies that Ryoshu, who is based on this enemy, would have some real synergy with Bind. And while you could argue that having a be faster than the enemy by X amount conditional is bind synergy, that doesn't really work when she's actually a haste ID, so while bind kinda helps her, she doesn't need it at all. In fact, if she didn't have any bind in her kit, I might not have as much of a problem with her. But she has one bind on her skill 3. It's like they remembered at the last minute what enemy they were basing this ID on, and just slapped that on there. Even worse, Butler Ryoshu is just a fucking Sank ID. Straight up. I mean, I like the Sank IDs, don't get me wrong, but I wanted way more out of this ID than to turn Butler's Mark into declared duel at home. It gets even worse when you remember that a bind synergizing Ryoshu ID just makes every bit of sense in the world considering Red Eyes and Red Eyes Open, but especially Red Eyes with its passive that allows you to inflict bind extremely consistently on Clash Win, no less. Which is clearly what Butler Ryoshu was designed to do, no? Now, I don't know what a bind-based ID would look like, but I'd much prefer whatever it ended up looking like over what Butler Ryoshu is now, since she just feels uninspired, even with her 3 attack weight skill 2 with an easy poise conditional. This isn't about strength. I think she's a good ID, and especially great in Mirror Dungeon, but in terms of my enjoyment of her in Limbus, she's really hard carried by the fact that she looks pretty in her Uptie 1 art, the fact she has a different hairstyle, and her cool animations, and she can thank her lucky stars for that. Haven't clicked off the video yet? Nice. Yuridivi Ryoshu is an ID ever. I think she looks neat, I remember enjoying her Uptie story, and that's about it. She's got good tremor count application and all that, her numbers are just fine, but I think compared to Yuridivi Honglu, she's really faded into the background, and hey, we really could use a short ID section after that Butler Ryoshu incident. Red Eyes Penitence Ryoshu is really strong, but also, I mean, she's pretty basic. While I have to admire her from an art and animation perspective, especially this Uptie 1 art in the cinematic that plays when you first acquire her, beyond being generically strong and fun from that point of view, they kinda just did warp Ryoshu, but again, and a bit better. Her skill 1 really has no right being as good as it is, since it's practically a skill 2 when conditionals are fulfilled, and her extra damage via her passive makes all of her coins feel just that bit stronger than most other IDs, which makes sense considering who she's based on. Speaking of that, the fact she calls her weapons Spiderhead and Skullface is also even funnier considering who she's based on, but I guess being the strongest doesn't mean you can't be a little bit silly. Her sprite changing with additional red eyes is the icing on top of a pretty enjoyable ID, though not my favorite of the Ryoshu bunch. Though I suppose we'll see if my favorite Ryoshu changes with this new ID. Now it's time for Meursault. Or maybe that was yesterday. I don't know. And we're better to start for the 5th Sinner than the 6th Association ID for him. Leo Meursault is one of 2 burn IDs that existed on launch. Things were really dire, and I am still not past the irony of the fact that 4th Match Flame was the ego meant to advertise Season 1 of Limbus, and yet, yeah, this is all we had. Anyways, Leo Meursault sucks ass, and it's a real shame considering his synergy with Quixote and the animation of Perfected Death Fist actually holding up pretty well considering he's a launch ID. Though in this instance, we do have to ignore the fact that this skill animation is somehow supposed to deal pierce damage. Yeah, I don't know why either. Maybe I am just a sucker for the Leo aesthetic, but even this most basic of Leo outfits I find pretty neat. Maybe it's just the shoulder pads, plus what is essentially a variant of Meursault's base ID weapon that I find charming, I suppose, though it's still not particularly notable. Warp Meursault is a tragic ID. He started off Limbus Company as arguably the single worst ID in the game, due to requiring a bunch of thread to uptie by nature of being a 3-star, but then also, he sucks absolute ass even at uptie 3. No charge generation, he needs a bunch of charge to do anything, and what he does is pretty mediocre. Then, uptie 4 came out, and he was the poster child used for uptie 4 to show the wonders it could bring to otherwise useless IDs. And in my opinion, it actually did a pretty good job of fixing him, but he was ultimately still just alright. Then, the first Walpurgisnacht rolled around, and Regret Meursault brought life back to the Meursault Nation, with Warp Meursault being the ID that got the biggest benefit out of using Regret, with his 3-coin skill 2 and 4-coin skill 3. For a while, with Regret, Warp Meursault was in the running alongside Rhino Meursault for being the best Meursault ID. And then, 4 months later, he was back to being pretty much never talked about again, due to Blade Lineage Meursault's existence. Considering the strength of Warp Dawn, I really think Warp Meursault deserved far better than he got. But I can only assume that PM wanted there to be a 3-star Meursault on launch, and said fuck it. And it's unfortunate because, whoo, it will be a while until we get to an objectively strong Meursault ID. I do still like Warp Meursault. His uptie 1 art is funny, if extremely outdated by modern standards, and his uptie 3 art is, sharp, to say the least, but there's ideas here that are unused on any other ID in the game, and the axe he uses as his weapon is pretty cool. N-Corp Meursault is the first ID released in Limbus Company, as in having a proper banner, and, yeah, I feel really bad for people who actually pulled out their wallets for this one. I don't have as much of a problem with his in-game sprite like the other N-Corp IDs, though the cracked face mask aesthetic is certainly a look. However, I hardly need to even look at him visually to come to a negative conclusion. I know that his skill 1's numbers get better below 50% HP, but seriously? A 2-coin, 7 rolling skill 1. How unbelievably dogshit can you get? And it's not like his 12 rolling skill 2 and 14 rolling skill 3 make up any difference. This was back when Project Moon insisted that tank IDs kinda just roll worse for funsies. A trend I am very glad has been phased out. Unfortunately though, I cannot strictly say Insult is terrible and move on, because there are some things to appreciate here. Like his skill 2's 5 bind and 2 attack power down. I think the fact that this can inflict 5 whole bind is really over the top and makes it a funny skill, despite how objectively terrible it is at clashing and dealing actual damage. His counter is one of the very few around launch that actually has his protection function properly. And this does allow for him to have a niche via stacking protection, though this niche would be a lot better if his actual skills were good. And his passive only adds to that protection stacking, And really, this passive is kind of ahead of its time in terms of having good effects, but the issue is that getting below 50% HP wasn't really ever gonna happen back when his numbers weren't abysmally unusable. I also do have to admit that his Uptai story lore gave some good insight into both Kanto 3 and Kanto 4, so credit where it's due. In conclusion, there's good ideas here, but I can't say I ever think of Meursault too much, though I would hardly say my thoughts on him are ever too good, or really too bad. Thumbs Sotocapo Rose Spanner, Meursault, has a funny concept with him being overly exhausted and a good Uptai story to boot. His numbers are fine. His Tremor Potency application is actually pretty good. His charge is weird. And, that's it. Rhino Meursault used to be one of my favorite IDs in the game. And for a similar reason to Sank Dawn, because he was one of the few speed-based IDs in the game at the time. But looking back on him, the choice to give him no haste in his kit and only max speed based on charge with a constant ramp up and ramp down, while it is interesting, it's not consistent enough to get the 7+ speed conditional off, therefore it kinda just feels bad. 3 to 11 speed range at 20 charge count gives you good odds to hit 7+ speed, but even just 2 haste alongside a 2 max speed increase from the passive would help a lot to raise that minimum even just a little bit. His bleed count is good if you can hit that 7+ speed, and while you can kinda hold off until you get it, that kind of playstyle has fallen to the wayside considering how ultra consistent speed IDs have turned out to be now. And this isn't really Rhino Meursault's fault, and that said I still really enjoy him, partly because he's an R-Corp ID and that's obviously cool, but he also looks silly in a way that I half enjoy and half hate, and then I fully enjoy it when he puts the helmet on, so it doesn't look like his head is a bit too small for his body. At the same time, I hope we see another Rhino ID that actually uses those big ol' hammers we saw in Ruina. That'd be neat. If only there was a sinner they'd give a Rhino ID to. Oh man, if only there was a sinner. Middle Meursault is odd. I like him on a surface level because I think that he represents an absolute middle ground for IDs. Ironic, I know. He's just completely fine, and has actual use cases while not standing out in any particular way. Except his skill 3 conditional, which yeah, this is pretty garbage. Easiest pop quiz ever time. How many active Sinner slots do most encounters in Limbus Company have? If you said 6, you're right. If you said 5, you're still more correct than the psychopaths who said 7. The point being that this Wrath skill makes it impossible in most cases to fulfill its own conditional, even in human fights. Middle Meursault's middling movement median of just about 5 speed means he will often end up in the middle, ruining your 6 Envy Absolute Resonance. You're not missing out on too much by not getting this conditional, since even if this was 5+ Envy Resonance, he still wouldn't be anything more than just pretty good Envy support, and hey, for what it is, he's pretty alright. So we've trudged through a sea of mostly mediocre IDs so far, so imagine how it felt back then, knowing that Meursault would be the one to get a bamboo-hatted Kim ID, which was guaranteed to not be a shoehorn tank ID. And yes, he still had aggro, but he's actually got real numbers now. Meursault is a behemoth of an ID, simply on the basis of doing something no other ID has done since, and that is working as a real team leader ID. Leo Rodian, following him, kinda gave an ironically half-baked attempt at being a team leader for the Leo IDs, and Kurokomo Ishmael is close, but I think what's been done with Biel Meursault just won't quite happen again. Blade lineage IDs were in a bad spot before Biel Meursault's release. Only 3 of them were in the game, and 2 of them were actually disgustingly awful. To combat this, Biel Meursault somehow actually manages to correct a lot of these bad IDs issues with just a single passive. And I'm not reading all of it out loud, but basically, get 3 Pride Resonance, everyone gets poise count, as well as damage and coin power on their skills. Happy days for all Blade Lineage members, hoorah. But he's not just limited to usefulness in buffing others. He's obviously got a good skill 1 and 2, but most importantly, there's the skill 3. And Yield My Flesh, despite me not using it quite as much anymore, is still a super fun skill to fire off. specifically to lose with it, and then to claim people's bones. I shouldn't have to say this, but to claim their bones is a skill that feels great to activate, let alone watch, and that dopamine is helped even more by how much damage this thing can do. So even though Meursault is in the far less cool Blade lineage compared to the Kurakumo clan, that does not stop him from being one of my favorites from an ID design and pure satisfaction standpoint. Dead Rabbit's boss, oh Dead Rabbit's boss. If Dawn is one of the worst up-tie 3 arts in the game, Dead Rabbit's boss is quite the opposite. In fact, I still think he has my favorite 2-star up-tie 3 art in the game. As an actual ID, I mean, the sprite is cool. Outside of that, I really don't have much to say about him. He's a Rupture ID that was meant to solve Rupture's clashing issue, I think. But his skill 3's clash win offense level down is really something when you think about it, because if it was on use, it could be significantly more useful. But I guess people in Project Moon London don't care about things being useful. Art really does imitate life, doesn't it? His art and sprite hard carry this ID to the B tier, and he's lucky his kit is only a little bit baffling to me, since he'd be going lower otherwise. Naturally, for any video like this, it's impossible that I've used every ID here equally. I have used some, the least, and I think Meursault might just be the ID I've used the absolute least of any in this video. That doesn't mean I don't know anything about him, but it might also lead you to realize that I don't like him all that much conceptually. Look, it's probably really hard being a Diechi ID. Diechi Rodian and Diechi Honglu set the bar so unbelievably high for Diechi 3 stars, and even Diechi Yi-song I think is a little underrated. So when a Diechi Section 4 Director ID is announced for Meursault, it gets overshadowed by contempt all Ryoshu, but also, your expectations are gonna be pretty high. Again, I don't envy his position, but Diechi Meursault didn't live up to the hype. It also didn't help that he was released in a season chock full of really solid sinking support. So even though his sinking count on the skill 1 is neat, his RNG sinking application on the skill 3 made him appear less than desirable. Then add on that seemingly mediocre unique status effect, Erudition, and well, here we are. Nothing about Diechi Meursault makes me too interested in him, besides having glasses and this discard synergizing passive, which I have to admit is probably pretty fun. He just lacks that same wow factor of the IDs I personally wanted him to be equal to, or hell, even surpass, as a Director ID probably should. Lastly, Meursault, and before anything else, I just want to point out something. And that is a very strange trend. Looking at when non-launch Meursault IDs released, specifically Insult, Rose Spanner Meursault, Middle Meursault, Dead Rabbit's Boss Meursault, and Meursault, we can remove Middle Meursault from this equation because he wasn't the first banner of the season, but the rest, yeah. Every season, besides 3, started with a new Meursault ID. The next closest sinner in terms of starting seasons off is Rodian with 2, both of which were banners shared with Meursault. Why is this? Well, it's very clear to me, Kim Ji-hoon loves big men, and is trying to appeal to everyone around the globe who loves big-chested, autistic men so he can make some sort of fan club. And if you don't believe me, let's look at the Meursault ID with a confirmed fan club. While Meursault is based on the worst NPC to ever ungrace Limbus Company as a video game, I actually think he's fucking hilarious. The idea of Meursault being a live streamer with fans who make edits of his streams is both relevant to the actual source material and blends into the Project Moon universe way better than a certain other Frenchman in my opinion. While I gave Sank East Dawn grief for being similar to Sank West Meursault, he did it first, and actually innovated on the Sank ID formula in a way I quite like, incentivizing only attacking an enemy's singular weak point over and over again. Does it help that Meursault is very versatile and is an excellent clasher alongside being good for the Gluttony Resonance Rupture team I use? Yes. Yes, it does help. Him being one of the few IDs made recently that has a Gluttony skill that isn't a skill 1 or absolute dogshit also helps my opinion of him, considering what a terrible spot Gluttony is in nowadays. Nothing more to say, he's simply peak. and probably the strongest Meursault ID as of now. Even if his focus attack gimmick is a bit hard to keep up, his payoff is more than worth it. Honglu's days are numbered. He gets ever closer to the inevitable end of that stupid little facade with every passing second, and he's got some pretty neat IDs to talk about as well. Kurikumo Honglu is perhaps the ID I've had the biggest turnaround on ever. Not to get completely derailed, but when I made this channel, I only ever had one video in mind that I really wanted to make. I believe the working title was something like Kurikumo Honglu, Worse Than You Think. That ended up being The Strange Case of Kurikumo Honglu, the first video I had catch on in the YouTube algorithm, and people misinterpreted it. Badly. My point in the video was about how despite being a batshit insane bullshit ID with things that make no sense, he's still good. Cloud Cutter is a skill that has not been matched to this day in terms of brainless skill to effectiveness on a 2-star ID. The only downside of Cloud Cutter is the low initial clash, but 4 coins in exchange for that was a small price to pay. I hated Kurikumo Honglu because he was anti-synergistic with a bleed team while having the highest bleed potency application in the game at the time. I feel almost bad in a way for making people think that Kurikumo Honglu is particularly terrible when he's still got the same thing he's always had, and that's Cloud Cutter. Even with a Kurikumo team existing, I'm not going to pretend like KK Honglu is super viable. But I do think if this bleed count conditional was swapped around, I'd actually like him a lot, even if he would get a lot worse, generally. Regardless of all of that, I have sentimental value attached to his video now, so I really can't hate him simply because he's part of the reason I'm here making this video right now. Okay, that's enough sappy shit. He goes in the B tier, and he would have been in the bottom tier if I didn't ever make that video on him. Ting Tang Honglu was the underdog pick compared to KK Honglu near the launch of Limbus, believe it or not. And I fought for this man tooth and nail. I praised Shank before it even had this damage bonus properly working, and I cheered when Funny Mutilate procced on an enemy. Of course, the reuse would just roll tails, but that's neither here nor there. Put it very simply, Ting Tang Honglu is an ID that I think really encapsulates Limbus well. He's got a lot of good tools and damage, a unique kind of skill 3, and above all, he's about gambling. Easily an S-tier ID, no questions asked. Yu Honglu sucks. His rolls are bad, his niche is filled by better IDs. I like his animations on his skill 2 and 3, I guess, but that's literally it. Next ID, please and thank you. K-Corp Honglu is such a fascinating ID. He's practically invincible, but with the downside of him not doing all that much in return. But his clashing isn't all that bad, unlike N-Corp Meursault. He's both one of the better IDs for a new player to pull for his niche but important use cases on certain fights, but he's also a noob trap in case you feel like he's necessary to use everywhere, because he absolutely isn't. Of course though, I have the most actual attachment to his support passive, considering how important it has been in the past for me doing my stupid challenge runs. He's not an idea I think about too often, but I think conceptually and visually he's very solid, and I wish we had at least one more K-Corp ID instead of the 3 Rose Spanners because they are so irrelevant to the story, while K-Corp was a major or minor antagonist for Kanto 3, Intervalo 1, and Kanto 4. Sorry, I had to get that off my chest. He's like B tier or something, I don't know. Warp Honglu is an ID I've always had a weird soft spot for. The fact his guard gives so much shield for a 2-star ID used to be a kind of valuable aspect of him, but with clashable counters and clashable guards being in the game now, less so. But I do think he's one of the IDs that would benefit the most from one of them, and still have it make some sense. His actual skills, while mostly mediocre, feel pretty good to fire off, and his spread of charge barrier makes it feel like he should have been a 2-star alongside W Otis, more so than alongside W Ryoshu, since he's basically a Warp Otis with no charge potency synergy. I do wish Honglu had a better ID to use alongside Dimension Shredder for charge and rupture synergy, but for what he is, Warp Honglu is fun. And I like how he's somehow having a good time working what must be one of the top 150 most traumatizing jobs in the city. Hook Honglu is one of the few speed IDs from the bygone era of X plus speed conditionals that still works, and doesn't feel terrible in my opinion. even though unfortunately for him, the new wave of bleed ID support has left him in a bit of an odd spot. He still works as a cheap bleed count and bleed potency machine. Granted, you do need to pull him during Walpurgisnacht, and his animations and actual sprite are great. He's another one of those budget 3 stars, similar to Leo Ryoshu, but while his X plus speed conditionals do not feel that bad, and his payoff is actually still decent, consistency is king in my eyes, and that has never been Hook Honglu's strong spot. Still, I really cannot give enough praise to his Uptie 1 and Uptie 3 art, since the early Ruina Backstreet Fixer Office aesthetic really works into Limbus in every way. If he was changed to have his coin power conditional be based on speed difference, like his skill 2 is, he might actually be one of my favorite 2 stars still. But he falls just a bit short of ID design perfection, even if his weapons are unique and cool as hell. Diechi Honglu, simply put, is my GOAT. He's a discard ID, which is already one of my favorite mechanics in Limbus, but he also uses discard in an interesting way, where he wants to maintain his insight and becomes an ID with only 3 options per turn. 1. Use the skill on the top slot of his dashboard. 2. Use an ego skill. Or 3. Risk losing his insight that makes him so powerful. It may seem like that would be limiting in practice, but the fact that his payoff is some of the most consistent clashing of any ID that isn't reliant on a status archetype for conditionals makes it rewarding. This is only bolstered by his animations, where even though he is clearly auditioning for the last spot of Smash's Fighter Pass, the sound effects and sheer absurdity of the concept really sell the whole thing. Not to mention his lore of forgetting and literally discarding knowledge is tied in super well to his actual mechanics, which is always a nice bonus. Yeah, Yuradivi Honglu did make me look pretty stupid that one time. 2 times, but who's counting? I don't really hold any ill will towards him regardless. He's nowhere near the strongest ID in the game, but he is arguably the ID carrying Tremor on his back the hardest. And as I mentioned before, I can't be mad at an ID with an actually good Gluttony skill, even if it is a Sloth skill in denial due to Tremor Reverb and all of its bursts. His weapon leads to some of the strangest individual sprites that I've ever seen while looking through ID sprites for videos. Like, what the fuck is even happening here? And he's just sucking on a lollipop in his Uptie 1 art. I'd love nothing more than to be a hard ass and get on him for having slightly worse conditionals than what we've come to expect of truly excellent IDs, but even I can't hate on such a pure level of whimsy. Also, I find it strangely charming that his passive felt the need to let us know that his weapon is an unauthorized invention. Not that I really understand what that's supposed to even begin to imply about Yuradivi Honglu, but it's cool, I guess. There's quite a bit I could say about Fang Hunt Honglu, like how he can actually achieve really high numbers against Blood Bags or Blood Fiends, or how he's 15/3 Rupture, but without any of the fun side of the archetype, really. However, all I really want to talk about for Fang Hunt Honglu is his Uptie story, because holy shit, what the fuck? I don't know who was writing this, but they either really like Honglu, or really hate him and want him to seem like a psychopathic asshole, and I'll be honest, I think it was a combination of both, and that's maybe the most terrifying option. I mean this completely unironically, it's one of the most interesting looks into a character we otherwise don't know too much about through an ID story. And I'm sure it will only make more sense once Can't Await is out. The main question I was left with after reading it was, how much of that was Honglu, and how much of that was the ID he's wearing? And that means I have to give some really big bonus points, because that almost never happens to me when reading these things. Oh yeah, and his skill 3 reuse is extremely funny looking. Just the way he poses and then remembers, right, gotta hit them again, is hilarious. I am someone who has gone on record saying that the main thing he wanted from a future Walpurgisnacht is a full stop office leeway ID. So it should come at no surprise that full stop office Honglu was a slam dunk for me. He could be absolutely terrible, and I'd still defend him from an aesthetic and purely conceptual point of view. Lucky for me, he's quite the opposite of terrible, and while his team-up mechanic with Heathcliff is a little bit pay-to-win, big quotation marks there, in a similar way to Manager Dawn, I just cannot bring myself to care in the same way, because it's fucking Leeway Honglu. His animations are great, the fact he can keep going without ammo was a gripe I had when I first saw his kit, but I've come around to liking it, especially since Heathcliff fills that dump ammo and leave role, and of course, I just love the way he looks. And his Updike story, I mean, it's all just so good. The only downside is that I wish Otis got the leeway ID, but the direction Project Moon took for Full Stop Honglu, with him using his family allowance for bullets, works just fine as it is. Lastly, we've got Yi-Sung. And while I could very easily make a shitty ideal pun as a transitional joke, I think it'd be better to just wing it. Please help me, I've been writing this script for 3 days. 7 Yi-Sung is such a weird ID. This isn't a secret, and while I could go into why his stat line is super unusual for a 2-star ID with his very high health and super fast speed, only made stranger by his seemingly confused design with all these debuffs, and yet his Rupture application is terrible, despite him probably being designed for Rupture at the start of the game. Yeah, the early 7 IDs were very non-committal in that sense, but my point is, I do not care enough about 7 Yi-Sung to even go into all of that, since my only real impression of him is he looks 10 times better in 7 Faust's ID art than his own. I mean, look at this sad Catman. He's adorable. And that upsets me because none of that energy is present in the actual ID art. Sorry, 7 Yi-Sung. If nothing else, people will defend your animations to the death, despite them just being alright in my opinion. Blade Lineage Yi-Sung is the other ID that gains coin power via his passive, but I think it's maybe implemented even better with him than with Middle Dawn. BL Yi-Sung was a free ID if you played the game around launch, and though no one really knew it at the time, he sucked at Uptide 3 due to having terrible numbers, and instead of directly upgrading his coin power, at least too much, I do like that Project Moon gave him coin power for every 5 poise count he has, up to a maximum of +3. Would a direct coin power buff across the board have been better? I mean, probably. But this is way more interesting, and in my opinion, more fun. Pre-BL Meursault, this made BL Yi-Sung a bit of a ramp-up ID. This unfortunately meant he didn't have too much of a niche, since long fights weren't all that prominent, but he always stood out as an ID with, and brace yourself when I say this, potential. With BL Meursault, I mean, it goes without saying, he's incredibly solid. And while his animations are simple, they're uniquely satisfying and nostalgic. And if there's one word that comes to mind when this ID is brought up, it definitely is nostalgia. And considering he's a launch ID, he holds up and does something unique that isn't unique in a terrible way. I just wish his Uptide 3 art wasn't inferior to BL Sinclair's, since he is superior in almost every other relevant way to that ID. Spicebush Yi-Sung hasn't done anything wrong. He's got fine numbers, and was the first instance of AoE on an ID skill. My issue with him is twofold. Firstly, I still have zero idea why this ID uses Tremor as his charge, instead of something unique like a blooming buff that does nothing. But sure, it gives him synergy with these passives that didn't exist at the time, but maybe that was planned. My much bigger, actual problem is that people love to glaze the fuck out of Sinking Deluge. In a mode like MD or Railway speedrunning, sure, Sinking Deluge is fine. Fighting enemies with SP is its best actual use case for sure, but most everywhere else, it just acts as a way to remove your sinking stack and make you, the player, depressed that your coin power conditionals aren't fulfilled anymore. I think his art and animations are pretty good, especially his skill 2, but the amount of times I've heard people pretend like he's the Jesus Christ of sinking due to Deluge is frustrating. Especially since the release of Sol Lament Yi-Sung sparked that debate up once again. It doesn't help that I think he's the least interesting bad end ID by a decent margin, since he really lacks the impact the others had on release, at least in my opinion. Hey, at least he's pretty, so that saves him from going lower than the B tier. Molar Yi-Sung is fine. He's discard, and that's fun. His weapon is cool and all, but he's got a similar problem to Manager Dawn, where this thing is way too big and awkward whenever I try to talk about him in videos. It doesn't really take away from my opinion on him, because I don't really have an opinion on him to begin with, besides that he's alright for Tremor. He gets to join some of the other Tremor 2 stars, and Liu Honglu, in the Neglected Inescu's video corner. Sorry if any of these are your favorites, it's not personal, except for the fact that it literally is. Ah yes, the beginning of Yi-Sung's aura farming phase. You're telling me that doing a flip after slashing your enemy in the air multiple times is something they teach you in basic combat training at W Corp? No shot. I have a complicated history with this ID, because it really was a final straw for me. Back when I hated charge IDs, it was the main thing I was known for. Lots of very funny, repeated jokes were made, and I got so sick of it that I genuinely caught COVID-19. This is not a joke, and I believe it was 2 days after I fell ill that this ID teaser dropped. This did a few things. Firstly, it deconfirmed that Farmwatch was coming to the game, and if you don't know what that is, be grateful. But I was a believer in its release and it didn't happen. Unlucky. More importantly, I was 100% unironically very sick, literally, and tired, figuratively, of Project Moon releasing charge IDs, to the point I actually released a video on it despite being completely lethargic. So to say my association with this ID is negative is a bit of an understatement. That said, in time I've come to appreciate W. Yisong for being pretty different as a charge ID and having some of the cleanest animations in the game. And I'm not even talking about his skill 3 necessarily, because his skill 2 is pretty badass and sharp as well. As much shit as I will give this, and a lot of the other Yisong IDs for doing a lot of Rule of Cool stuff, it is really cool, and I actually don't have a problem with it at all. So Warp Yisong lives in a state of limbo in my mind. Or well, he would, if he wasn't genuinely just really cool. The old Escu would never approve. Whatever, he's so cool, he's going in the A tier. Season 3's seasonal IDs really just didn't miss. Except that one time. First mate Yisong, even though his skill 2 conditional isn't super practical to get off consistently, the fact it's even in the game at all is a treat. And a 5-coin skill 2 is certainly enough to stand out in a crowd of mediocre 2-star IDs. I'm glad that his poise and poise count generation aren't crazy. It keeps him feeling like a 2-star, but also makes you think about what happens if you try to give him poise via other passives or ego gifts, and the answer is you stab shit. A bunch. Like a lot. I wish there was a better word for that. But regardless, you can't really get that anywhere else. His uptight arts completely oppose each other in a nice way that fits the vibe of Canto 5, and as you'll see in the next part of this video with another ID, I really like the Stormy Night uptight arts in the game, few and far between as they are. Also, this is the only ID that actually gives Yisong wings, considering the way he just takes off in his skill 3. I mentioned that Diechi Yisong was underrated in my opinion, and that is true. I think I like him more than most people. Which is to say, I have heard almost nothing but terrible things about him, and I just think he's kinda cool. Back before sinking was super supported, using his guard and tanking hits seemed like an okay alternate way to get sinking potency on the enemy, which I appreciated. But it's a shame that his uptight 3 art is pretty bad. Something about it just looks wrong. Like his head is too small, or his body is too big. I'm sure some snarky artists will correct me in the comment section, and hey, you know what? I encourage it. His conditionals changing from sinking to a below 50% HP conditional on just his skill 3 also makes him odd. But I still don't think he's all too bad. Unfortunately, he's still ultimately C tier, because let's face it, not everyone can be B tier. Solemn Lament Yisong is based on my favorite abnormality. He's gonna go into the S tier on that basis alone, but his animations are so smooth, his sound design is exactly what you'd expect from someone with these Solemn Lament guns, he's strong, Butterfly is a fun effect, though I gotta admit the wall of text associated with his unique ammo, the Living and the Dead, and the reload stuff, is a big reason I have not tackled a sinking video yet. If I can have a single gripe, I do wish he wasn't revealed in a live stream, and instead got the same teaser image Magic Bullet Otis and Dawn Claire got. Because those kind of teasers are much more effective to me. But really, when you've got Yisong posing like he's on the front page of a Fixer magazine after his skill 3 is used, why bother complaining? Just call the ID peak and move along. LCE Lantern Yisong is also up there with Diechi Meursault for IDs I've never really used. But his skill names alone and his gimmicky kit that actually has a payoff and fun way to play is enough for me. This is the motherfucker who single-handedly made it so Project Moon had to abbreviate skill names that were too long on IDs. And while I hate how it cuts off some things for other IDs, the fact it's because the idiosyncrasies of the source may be utilized with greater flexibility is a skill name in Limbus now is just too good to pass up. He's nowhere near as flashy as Ardor Blossom Faust, but I think he does the sacrificial lamb gimmick better by not being as good of an ID. So losing him doesn't feel like losing an actually valuable team member, unlike with Faust. He also definitely could have gotten away with having lame skill animations, but they're actually pretty creative and utilize the Fey Lantern assets, which just adds bonus points to an already good ID. Liu Yisong is fucking awesome. I love his Uptie story. His Uptie 1 and Uptie 3 art are both great, though the first one is best because it reminds me that I, too, can wear a Liu Association hoodie and be just like Yisong. What's that? I have a bias towards Liu IDs? Yeah? So what? He's another burn ID that just has good numbers, and while burn animations were starting to get a bit too similar to each other, Yisong shows up with a fucking sword. Though I will say, in retrospect, Ryoshu was robbed, but the Liu Association was likely worried about the consequences of giving the scary woman a more potent weapon. His skill 3 definitely didn't need to be as strong as it is, but I'm glad they did make it that good because it solidifies him as a core burn support in the form of SP healing, but also an incredibly good damage dealer. I could talk more about what his existence implies for burn as a team, but that seems better suited for a different video. And that's every ID I wanted to cover in this video. All 59 IDs, 10 on every Sinner, except for Ryoshu, who only has 9 at this point in time. And that's definitely all of them. That I wanted to cover anyways. Let's cut to the chase. Do I really need to talk about Ring Yisong? What is there to say that hasn't been said already about him? Is what I wish I could say. Seriously, there's always something new with this guy. Every single video I make somehow ends up involving him, and I am so sick of it. Even now, I feel the need to mention that his status as the strongest ID isn't completely uncontested anymore. I won't get into the exact specifics, but I do think some of the more recent IDs are finally starting to give him at least a run for his money. And that is everything I will say about him. I used to enjoy him a whole lot more, but talking about him endlessly has ruined my perception of him to the point of just rolling my eyes every time I realize I must discuss the holy father of reuse coins once more. I think I finally understand a fraction of the disdain Kim Ji-hoon has towards this ID. Go in the C tier and think about what you've done. I will take solace in 100% not having to talk about you in the second part of this video. And with that said, looky, it's a tier list. That should reactivate your neurons and or wake you up. This isn't meant to be very specific or taken too seriously since it's barely ordered besides the S tier, but I'll be following up on this tier list in the second part of the video. Besides, the tier list isn't the point of this video, it's about the friends we made along the way, and the listening to my opinions along the way too. There was a lot of that. And speaking of my opinions, you got through all of them for now. So, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll stick around for part 2. And that this video didn't end up being the last straw for you to give up and unsubscribe from the SGU channel, just because I dislike Butler Ryoshu. Regardless of your opinions on my opinions, this video ends now.